One of the strange things about this job is the territory that you return to, you are compelled to return to again and again, and the concern, and indeed perhaps even the fear of repetition. I come back to the same territory and ask the same question can be very, very powerful. But it can also be a little bit dull. It can be a little bit literally repetitious. And I feel a little bit like that every time Israel starts killing people in Gaza. How do I bring you into this conversation afresh? How do I keep your interest? Because the question that is on the tip of my tongue, we came close to asking on Thursday of last week, which is about caring. And it's about the fact that the world doesn't care enough, or at least our bit of the world doesn't care enough. I've got two sort of haunting memories in this space. One involves Joe Biden warning Benjamin Netanyahu that they must not allow the atrocity of October the 7th to become their 9/11. It wasn't immediately clear to me what he meant by that. But it was an acknowledgement from the then President of the United States that the overreaction, the enormously, I think we can say with 2020 hindsight, the enormously disproportionate response to that hideous terror attack had ultimately done a lot more harm to the world and to the United States than good. And that was an early and an explicit warning. He appealed to Israel. You may not even remember this, not to be consumed by rage in its response to the attack by Hamas. It's a big ask if you remember the hideous reports, the hideous footage of that original October the 7th attack. But he simultaneously pledged stalwart support for Israel for its self-defense. And the UK was pretty much in lockstep with the US. It isn't now. David Lammy, even before the latest atrocities inflicted upon Gaza began overnight, David Lammy, our Foreign Secretary, had described the recent decisions to suspend aid to the Gaza Strip as being in breach of international law. And there's that question again. Who cares? I know you might. I know I do. But who cares enough? So that's haunting memory one. The second one is you. It's people who rang this show. And we used to, in the earlier days of this conflict, we used to always run up against the same obstacle. Do you remember? Do you remember what it was? That I was interested in the question of how much death would be too much death. At what point would Joe Biden's warning become true? At what point would you be able to say that Benjamin Netanyahu had failed to avoid being consumed by rage? I mean, I don't know that it's rage. I think self-interest is obviously a very fat slice of his motivation, political survival, staying out of court, all the rest of it. But I would ask my callers, and again, they were not bad people by any stretch of the imagination. They were people who remind us of the difference between supporting the existence of the modern state of Israel and supporting the administration currently leading it. Two very, very, very different propositions. But it's a lot easier to say that when you have no skin in the game. But people would balk at the question of how much is too much. Caller after caller, actually, if you remember. How much is too much? How much death is too much death? 10,000? 20,000? 30,000? 40,000? 1 million? 2 million? And you knew they were members of the Israeli cabinet who were essentially saying the quiet part out loud, letting it be known that they would be comfortable with the death and or removal of all of them. All of the Palestinian people living on the Gaza Strip, in excess, of course, of 2 million. One of them talked about dropping a nuclear bomb on the place. Others talked of, I think, razing it to the ground. That rhetoric seemed hideous and extreme at the time. The idea that there would be no point at which people would say, I think we've gone too far. I don't know where this ends. Where is it now, that school of thought? Donald Trump sought to take all the credit for the peace agreement, the ceasefire, and I think possibly he did deserve some of it. Joe Biden, and I think this is a bit that is missing from a lot of the analysis, I think Joe Biden prevented Netanyahu from going nuclear, not literally necessarily, but from going absolutely much further than he did in the early in the immediate response to October the 7th, where everybody felt Israel would, or almost everybody felt Israel would be within its rights to respond on an apocalyptic scale. I think Joe Biden and Blinken, his Secretary of State, managed to just keep a lid on the scale of the response. But of course, death by 1,000 cuts versus death by one massive strike is still death, is still the same death. And then you come to a bit more on Biden. He said his country had sought and got justice, but had also made mistakes in the context of 9/11. And then you come to today. Another thing I'd tell you quickly before you waste time texting me, and with understandable, but I think sadly mistaken tropes and catchphrases, is that among the people most outraged and heartbroken by the events overnight are the families of the remaining Israeli hostages. So please don't buy the idea that this is an action that has been taken on their behalf. Families of Israeli hostages have said their greatest fear has been realized, with the advocacy group representing them saying today that I'm going to get their words exactly right. The family's headquarters for the return of the abductees claimed that it had attacked Hamas targets in Gaza to facilitate the release of the hostages. They described that claim as a complete deception and demanded a return to the truce. Here's a quote for you. The Israeli government chose to give up on the hostages. We are shocked, angry and terrified by the deliberate dismantling of the process to return our loved ones from the terrible captivity of Hamas. And that truce that they talk of was the one that Netanyahu sought to abandon, has now abandoned. It was supposed to move on to the next stage. They sought to extend the last stage. The next stage would have involved a reduction in the military presence in Gaza. And he can't countenance that because the far-right members of his own cabinet will withdraw their support for him if he withdraws military personnel from Gaza. To be fair, no one is surprised by this, even when he signed up for the truce. He made his misgivings clear. Anybody paying attention knew that it was unlikely to hold, and that when it did break, it would probably break from his end. The spokesperson added, returning to fighting before the last abductee is released will come at the cost of the 59 abductees who are still in Gaza and could be rescued and returned. The spokesman said, adding, military pressure endangers hostages and soldiers. President Trump briefed on these strikes before they were carried out, gave his full support. The White House gave his full support. And the situation on the ground in Gaza remains as hideous as it has been now for months. Hospitals already buckling under the pressure of having scant resources, limited personnel, overcrowded rooms and beds, people in tents, of course, among the targets, among the things, for want of a better word, hit by the latest Israeli attack, and the hospitals can't cope. The Red Cross, the United Nations, Amnesty, doing all of these things, pointing out all of these things, and yet who is listening? The people welcoming the strikes could be loosely described as hardliners. It is a shattering of a fragile ceasefire, make no mistake, but Bezalel Smotrich is delighted. It is a phased operation that we have planned and built in recent weeks, he has said, making it clear that there was never any intention to abide by either the timetable or the content of the original truce. This moment is why we remained in the government, he added, in case you think my analysis is a little bit wrong. This moment is why we remained in the government. In other words, Netanyahu had to resume the killing in order to keep power. Here's one from Sue. Here we go. Here he goes, Jihadi O'Brien, lapping up everything the Palestinian health BS throws out. Do us a favour and stop believing the lying scum. Okay, Sue, so I'm going to believe Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister in Benjamin Netanyahu's government. And he is telling you, because I've already seen this, but it's just going to be news to you, this is a phased operation that we have planned and built in recent weeks. This moment is why we remained in the government. And he had, as I'm sure you know, Sue, previously threatened to pull out of the ruling coalition if Israel didn't restart its war against Hamas. In other words, if Israel didn't abandon the truce. You'll also be aware, of course, that Netanyahu has sacked his intelligence chief, who was looking into allegations that other members propping up Netanyahu's administration have been engaged in corruption and accepting bribes. So it's all there. The only bit missing at the moment is David Lammy's comments that Israel is breaking international law. The first time a British Foreign Secretary has said this in the context of recent conflicts. So in the House of Commons, he described the 2-week blockade of food, fuel and medicine imposed by Israel as appalling and unacceptable. 2.3 million Palestinians living in comparative, for want of a better word, squalor. So now you know. Even Sue now knows the facts. So what's the question? If all the hostages, dead and alive, were to be returned to Israel tomorrow, do you think this would stop? Netanyahu has said previously that it wouldn't stop. The people propping up his government, and this is the bit that I think a lot of British coverage has already missed and completely missed. The political survival, the freedom and liberty of Benjamin Netanyahu depends upon the support of people who are as extreme as it gets when it comes to what they would like to do to the human beings living in Gaza. And it's not even speculation or reading between the lines that leads us to that conclusion anymore, because they say it out loud. Smotrich has said, I've read it to you, he has said explicitly that this has been planned for a long time, which means that the truce was never intended to be fully observed, and that the carnage must continue until, in his words, Hamas has been completely destroyed, something which nobody believes is possible. So it's not for me or you, I can't stop you from doing it, but it's not for me to use words like genocide at this point. That is something that is determined by international courts and international law, courts and laws, of course, which the Israeli administration treats with ill-disguised contempt. But for the rest of us, if you believe in a rules-based order, that the time when it's most important you stick to it is when other people are riding roughshod over it. And I don't think there can be much dispute about the accuracy of the phrase ethnic cleansing, if not in the actions so far, although for me I can probably argue that does apply, certainly in the expressed ambitions of people like Bezalel Smotrich. And for reasons at least as much of self-preservation as enthusiasm for ethnic cleansing, Benjamin Netanyahu as well. Vladimir Putin has essentially been given a free pass by Donald Trump's White House. You can tell from the escalation of attacks on Ukraine. You know that the call that's scheduled to take place today is likely to involve a carving up of Ukrainian assets. We will have to wait and see, but it is unlikely to be good news for the man Donald Trump described as a dictator not long ago and who he sought to humiliate in the Oval Office. What message has been sent to Benjamin Netanyahu? If Vladimir Putin has received a gold foil-wrapped telegram telling him he can carry on doing whatever he wants, and if there is a ceasefire, it will be on his terms, not Zelensky's, what message has been sent to Benjamin Netanyahu by Donald Trump's administration? What has he been told? Because I don't believe that this will stop when the hostages are returned. I don't believe that the finish line is describable or visible. I don't know how this ends, but I can't quite yet conceive of circumstances in which things are not going to get much, much worse before they even begin to entertain the possibility of getting better. Perhaps the silliest conversation is the one about Hamas being destroyed, because the longer this goes on, the more people die. All of the arguments are fairly clear that this has become and is becoming a great call to arms for future resistance and continuing enmity towards Israel. So 19 minutes after 10 is the time. Is it ever going to end? Do you, knowing what you know, and I hope you know a little bit more now than perhaps you did at 10 o'clock, knowing what you know, can you conceive of circumstances now? And you might think this is incredibly naive of me, but when Joe Biden was in the White House, I felt that there would be a limit upon the carnage that Netanyahu would unleash. And they talk about the gates of hell. They say it out loud. When Joe Biden was in the White House, I felt that there was a bulwark. What's a better word than that? I never know if I pronounced that word correctly. bulwark. I felt that there was a firewall. That there was, however hard we found it to answer the question of how much would be too much, and you can absolutely berate me for being naive on this one. When Joe Biden was in the White House, I felt that there would be a point at which Israel's hand would be stayed. I hate to say this out loud, but I don't think there is anymore. And of course, one thinks back to the people who rang me and sounded sensible and kind, compassionate and thoughtful, and claimed that one death was too many, until you asked them how many deaths would really be too many. And they couldn't tell you. How widespread would support for the eradication of Palestinian people in Gaza be if people like Smotrich continued to propel Benjamin Netanyahu into what they describe themselves as the gates of hell? How much is too much? 0345 6060 973. It's an incredibly febrile area of discussion. Passions rarely run higher. I'm comfortable with all the abuse that I get from both sides on this. Although I don't actually get much abuse, I've got to be honest, from proper humanitarian supporters of the Palestinian people, or from genuine Israeli advocates of the hostages' families, or believers in the two-state solution. But still, the abuse can be pretty unpleasant, and that's fine. But this is the question that has been bubbling under the surface since the horrors of October the 7th. And the question is, do you believe that Israel is both capable of and desirous of destruction in Gaza on a scale that we haven't come close to seeing yet? Do you believe that that's possible? 0345 6060 973. Possible, stroke probable, stroke inevitable, or none of the above. That they will continue to do what Smotrich wants to do, what others want to do, and essentially destroy Gaza. Trump's talked about removing everybody from the place. He's bought into the idea that he could turn it into a resort. Again, how seriously do you take him? But how feasible does it sound to you today that Israel will never stop, regardless of what happens with the hostages? Is it possible? Is it probable? Is it inevitable? Or is it none of the above? That with Donald Trump in the White House and Benjamin Netanyahu's very survival, not just political, but his civilian liberty, depending upon the continuation of hostilities, the continuation of carnage, how feasible, possible, probable, inevitable, or none of the above, do you find it that they are going to do what the most extremist and far-right members of Netanyahu's government obviously want him to do?